Since the late 1920s, moving forward to the 1940s and to present time, mental health has become one of the most common themes and concepts in films.
All the doctors, besides Dr. Fletcher, say that we're the same person, just personalities. Huh? How do you explain I'm the only one that needs these, you mother?
We see it in a variety of film genres, frequently used in horror, drama, thriller, war, crime and mystery, historical films, and the list goes on. And usually, the style of those films which are portraying mental health have episodic, documentary, or traditionally narrative-led ways of filmmaking. However, avant-garde films offer more experimental and non-narrative-led ways of film, which from personal and public viewing, shows that this mode of cinema creates a different kind of feeling and point of view on mental health representation. In this video essay, I will discuss the difference between avant-garde and traditional filmmaking and go in depth of mental health representation in both modes of cinema to reveal the possibility of avant-garde films creating a bigger impact in comparison to traditional films. Before we get into the representation of mental health in avant-garde films versus traditional films, I must explain the origin and the difference between this style of filmmaking with the traditional cinema, in order to really understand why the impact of this mode of cinema can and is so different and possibly more impactful than the rest. Avant-garde films originally appeared in the early 20th century, during a time of avant-garde movements in painting and literature. As Studio Binder explains, surrealist artists of the 1920s found immense possibilities within the cinematic medium. Some of the earliest and most iconic experimental films include René Clair's Entr'acte, Fernand Léger and Dudley Murphy's Ballet Mécanique, and Marcel Duchamp's Anamic Cinema. Avant-garde always was a rebellious movement, and that rebellion can be seen in any of the films, despite the chosen genre. The components such as mise-en-scène, editing, sound, and cinematography stand to show that rebellion, as well as other signs that William E.B. Verone writes about in his book, the avant-garde feature film A Critical History, such as unique director's vision, mixing styles and genres, an unusual manner of representation, of reality or otherwise, poetic and lyrical flourishes, etc. Coming back to Studio Binder, it writes that post-World War II, there was a significant surge in avant-garde filmmaking as artists and filmmakers aimed to challenge the commercial dominance of Hollywood and explore new artistic frontiers. This quote once again just signifies my point on avant-garde film rebellion and having its own expressionistic style that creates a bigger impact upon viewers and the film industry itself. Furthermore, in explaining the difference between the two, William E.B. Verone explains what to expect while watching an avant-garde film. And the quote says, "Avant-garde films involve the senses in ways that are atypical of mainstream films. Nothing is ever clearly denoted to you, so you have to work." While watching any avant-garde film, I'm sure that the audience immediately catches on to what this quote means, which is that because there is no narrative leading the audience onto the next scene of action, the viewer has to be much more immersed into the film to understand the symbolism, characters, and the plot. However, William E.B. Verone also says, that is not to say that all avant-garde films are completely strange and have no form of narrative continuity or plot construction. Many do, especially feature films. And this basically means that the audience isn't completely screwed. Big yay to the audience! To further explain the difference, traditional films have been here since 1878, as that's the first motion picture appeared. From that point on, there were many developments and evolvements, from black and white films to color films, silent films to sound, and so on. Traditional films have always focused on narrative and the norm of action, unlike avant-garde films. There's more art and expressionism to feel and see than in traditional films. In a way, avant-garde films have a heavier feel to them from the very beginning of the film compared to traditional films, when the heaviness is only felt if something happens or is about to happen to a character. Avant-garde films carry its oddness and alien atmosphere from start to finish. And now, this is the part where my torment of you, my dear viewer, begins. The representation of mental health in avant-garde versus traditional films. Warning, I strongly encourage you to get a snack and a nice drink to occupy yourself with because my voice will soon be the last thing you'll ever want to hear. Oh, and be prepared for some dark themes being mentioned from the example films. Warning over. In helping you to understand why my stomach does a backflip every time I watch an avant-garde film that depicts mental health, I will use Robert Eggers' black and white film, The Lighthouse, as it's overflowing with not only the main elements and traits of avant-garde style, but a much heavier and darker portrayal of mental health. The Lighthouse is riddled with illusions, mythology, chaos, and confusion of what's next and what the next thing we see means. An article from Mashable says that there's no single correct way to understand what happens in The Lighthouse. The non-narrative style of this film is definitely to thank for this. However, it's the director's vision itself that is the reason why it's hard to understand what we have seen and what's to come. Even through the confusion and plot twists and turns, the main themes of the film are clear through all the chaos. And chaotic it definitely was. The story follows two main characters, Thomas Wake, played by William Dafoe, and Abraham Winslow, played by Robert Pattinson, who are 19th century lighthouse keepers stationed at a remote New England outpost in the middle of a storm. Throughout the film, we see Abraham on the edge of sanity as he battles through drunken and trauma-caused hallucinations, nightmares of his own death, and mythological creatures such as a mermaid, who he has intercourse with later in the film during one of his hallucinations, which could indicate his need of release and yearning for something biologically and instinctively normal. Although, intimacy with the fish is definitely far from the norm. Anyway, he also sees flashes of a man who died by drowning at Abraham's old workplace, but Thomas Wake argues that it was a deliberate murder, making Abraham wary, uncomfortable, and guilty. This is important to mention as at the end of the film, Abraham murders Thomas Wake with an axe. A quote from Mashable also mentions that the movie also implies that our unreliable narrator was never of sound mind even before arriving on the island. That's because Abraham did murder his former colleague, named Abraham Winslow, and that this whole time Abraham's real name was Thomas Howard. And if this fact doesn't scream he's a madman, I don't know what does. Now, the acting and the set aren't the only parts that make this film so intensely alluring and heavy, but it's also thanks to the sound design and filmmaking equipment that helped to create this isolating, confusing, twisted, and paranoia-filled feeling/atmosphere. The common jumping shots of different scenes and hallucinations, alongside the intense sound of the lighthouse sirens, ringing sounds, horns, and staccato, playing during Thomas Howard's nightmares, rants, and hallucinations, and basically throughout the whole film is what depicts his mental state and feeds the film expressionism and a suffocating feeling. That guilt, anxiety, chaos, paranoia, and madness that he feels really shows through both of the actor's poetic and expressionistic performances too, as Thomas Wake goes as far as gaslighting Abraham away from reality, away from sanity, making him question time and his own mental state. He doesn't trust Abraham and definitely has him under his control. Well, until Abraham snaps, after all his failed attempts to get inside the lighthouse, which is definitely one of the main reasons for his lost control of sanity. He chases Thomas Wake with an axe and destroys their lifeboat, their only way back to sanity and safety. Thomas Wake's only way to tell the authorities of Abraham's crime. Nothing beats the act of murder, except what comes after. And in Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, the monster from a children's fairy tale comes to life as something much more sinister. In this traditional psychological horror film, we follow a mother's story and her battle with the fresh trauma of losing her husband and having to raise their son alone. Or so she thinks. Often people say that trauma is haunting, but whatever lurks inside her house seems much bigger and scarier. It's the aftermath of loss, depression, anxiety, and guilt. The Babadook. An article from Screen Rant explains that the strange events that happen at home find Amelia resenting her son, who she seems to blame for his father's death without reason. Their tenuous relationship, despite her displaying a protective mother's ferocity, seems to fuel the beast who haunts them. What makes this traditional psychological horror film actually scary, and trust me, it still gives me the chills as I speak, besides the actual classical jump scares and sound design or the costumes, is the fact that this monster is based on real-life fears, traumas, and pain, which is why the ending of the film leaves you feeling a little hopeless, despite Amelia, played by Essie Davis, and Samuel, played by Noah Wiseman, surviving. That's because Amelia locks the Babadook in their basement and tends to his needs, feeding him earthworms. This is a metaphor which Screen Rant explains how people who struggle with mental illness, especially depression, often have to live with their inner demons and hardships by trying to keep them at bay instead of extinguishing them once and for all. The film itself, in my opinion, doesn't seem to be very different from other psychological horror films in sense of the filmmaking tools and style, and it definitely cannot compare to the heaviness of the situation the viewer feels while watching The Lighthouse. However, it does well to leave you scared and sinking into the feeling that in reality, there was no actual happy ending, instead an everlasting problem in the characters' lives. I think The Babadook is a clever film that represents mental health in a truly disturbing way through costume design, sound design, performance, and directing, but especially through the symbolism and the meaning behind this monster, which scares Samuel like any other child at his age, and grows through Amelia's resentment and mental illness that feeds it. There's a battle between the monster and the mother. She fuels it, but also fears it, grows it, which then gives more power to scare and affect Samuel. And this also could be interpreted as Samuel fearing his mother, who metaphorically is the monster. My final thoughts. Both film styles satisfy and impress the audience, some changing their lives or points of views, However, avant garde films will always uphold a certain power in its uniqueness, expressionism, oddness, and history that provides the bigger impact upon the audience.